The Oxford Dictionary defines exile as the state of being sent to live in another country that is not your own, especially for political reasons or as punishment. Now, this can be self-imposed, and I'd like to compare the experience of an exile and the whole idea of an exile with our situation today. You and I are not living in another country, so that doesn't quite qualify. We're actually living in a place that we call home, maybe spending a little more time than we feel comfortable with, which is kind of another discussion. We have not been removed, oppressed, targeted, or persecuted for political reasons or as punishment. Now, the past month may have felt like punishment for you, but it doesn't quite in the strictest sense qualify, or a little different from the experiences of your typical exile. I've never personally been exiled myself. None of what I have experienced technically qualifies as exilic. So again, on a technical level, I have no personal understanding of what exile feels like, and yet there is something in my mind, and perhaps yours as well, that feels strangely similar to what I would imagine the exilic experience to be like. Take some biblical examples. In the Old Testament, we read about God's people being exiled by and into Babylon. Some people were left behind and remained in Jerusalem, and others were taken to Babylon. First, those who remained behind, they weren't actually removed from their home or native country. Can we say that they didn't experience exile? Things were very different. Nothing seemed the same as before Babylon took over. So life in Jerusalem certainly would have been different after Babylon had conquered them. Daniel was one of those who was taken, the prophet Daniel. Although we don't know with precision, Daniel was around his early mid-teens. He had so much to look forward to. Plenty of life to live, as we would say. In the Hebrew culture, he would have been considered an adult by this time. And from the little biographical information that we can glean from Scripture, he was a very talented, attractive, athletic, and intelligent person, just to name a few of his appealing characteristics. So if we dig a bit deeper and consider his experience in Babylon during this time, we find similarities. And if so, then we can glean from his experiences and others to apply to our current situation. Without reading too much into the story, it is evident that the experience of being removed to Babylon would have taken him from his family. We assume that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were his friends from the beginning, but all we are told is that they too were from the tribe of Judah. We can't assume that they knew each other, let alone were friends before being exiled together. Without family, and perhaps without friends, this is Daniel's experience. He was young. Regardless of how talented and gifted he would have been, he was still young. Perhaps a mature teenager, but let's put this in perspective, placed in the company of the enemy. He must learn a new language. Worship? Out of the question. Daniel would live during the time of Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 586 BC. So if I pause for a second, there's something that overlaps with our current experience, isn't there? We can't go to borrow the word, our temple. We can't meet with other people, have that normal, prescribed, expected religious experience at church. Daniel couldn't. And the temple was destroyed in 586 BC. No more temple. Center and structure of God's presence among his people, gone. Daniel lived under constant fear, suspicion, and threats from those he worked with and were surrounded by all day, every day. And not to belittle anyone's spiritual struggle these days, but certainly Daniel's were hefty, weren't they? A lot weightier in comparison to ours. Unfamiliarity, less than ideal spiritual conditions, loneliness, fear, uncertainty, particularly of the future. I would suppose that these were floating regularly in Daniel's mind during his life. These were at the center of the exilic experience. Sound a bit familiar and common among people's experiences today? I think so. Working from home, not in your office, not at your typical workplace for most of you. You miss people. Can Daniel, no friends, no family anymore. Hard to worship through a TV? I get it. It's kind of hard to, even for me, I only do the call to worship, but I can only imagine how challenging it would be to preach to an empty room. Need and desire for personal, interactive fellowship? Certainly, God created us human beings, physical, sensual, and so that's part of our experience. Why would that not play a part in the liveliness and the fullness, the depth of coming together as God's people to worship? Stripped from us, no longer available. Does that deplete every opportunity to really experience the Lord? Tired of Zoom? Trust me, I'm zoomed out. Need space? Need to get out? I want things to return to normal? Again, I would suppose that Daniel had similar thoughts, along with many other exiles during that time. Yet Daniel was able to live out one of the greatest testimonies of God's power and be an exemplary witness of fidelity to the Lord, even in the midst of opposition and persecution. In 1553, to go to a more contemporary historical example. In 1553, Mary, first daughter, the child of Henry VIII, became Queen of England. Her brother Edward ruled as a Protestant monarch. However, Mary, like her mother, was a staunch Roman Catholic. She immediately implemented measures to bring Edward's English Protestantism back in line with the Vatican. No more Protestantism, back to being Roman Catholic. One particular measure was the burnings of Protestants. You got to scare people, you got to punish others as well. Early during her reign, in a span of 3 months, 300 Protestants were burned at the stake. Fear of persecution forced approximately 800 Protestants to flee to continental Europe, places like Netherlands, where they could find greater freedom and liberty to worship and to express their faith. Times were bleak. Protestant faith nearly extinguished in England, or so it seemed. Those who fled found opportunity to establish one of the most prolific periods in early modern Christian history. In many ways, this period served to fortify, invigorate, and strengthen the church that seemed to be hanging by a thread. Again, similarities to where we're at? Do we cower at the lack of resources, to the lack of normality? Sure, this is not the way things should be, but this is how it is. We live in a fallen world and we experience fallen conditions, sometimes greater than others. And the writer of Hebrews, I think, touches a bit on this and encourages us to put everything into perspective. In Hebrews 11, you may be familiar with that chapter. It's the Hall of Faith chapter. It summarizes the faith of key biblical figures. And at one point, the writer makes us realize that God had given promises to them that they never saw the fulfillment of. In an earthly sense, in a this lifetime sense, they did not live to see the fulfillment of those promises, but God had given them. We are then told that all of these were seeking a homeland, that one common desire within all them was to settle down, was to reside somewhere that God had selected, had set apart for them. A homeland where they could thrive and prosper. But they understood, according to the writer of Hebrews, that that was not to be found on earth and in this life. Chapter 11, verse 16 of Hebrews tells us they desired a better country. So this is a reminder even for us that we're not meant for this place. We're meant for more. That we're on a journey to somewhere better. That this isn't somewhere where we place our final roots deep so as to never leave. But we desire, like them, a better country. And the writer of Hebrews tells us that that better country is a heavenly one. It's heaven itself. Philippians 3:20 tells us that we have our citizenship in heaven, not on this earth. We are people of God's home, not earth. And you and I are just strangers to this world. We live an exilic type experience, an exilic type life in a fallen world. We are sojourners traveling through to the celestial city as John Bunyan portrayed in his famous book, The Pilgrim's Progress. So our times are exilic. They're exilic-like, strange, abnormal, but nonetheless an opportunity through which God of the Old Testament and the New Testament, the God of the former temple, the God during the biblical exiles, is the same God before Corona and after Corona. That wherever you may be, under whatever circumstances, the God of the patriarchs, the God of old, the Alpha, the Omega, he doesn't change. And he is this God to you today. And I hope that encourages you that even in these challenging times, what a wonderful opportunity it still is to serve our God, to be faithful, and to be witnesses of the gospel. God bless.